today I would like to have a conversation with you about the two different kind of, let's say, founding fathers, if you will, William Bradford and John Winthrop, and their journeys and what those two journeys and settlements mean in terms of in American history.
Mhm.
And the first question I would like to ask you is: would William Bradford and John Winthrop still be considered American by today's system of values in the United States?
Thank you, Anwar. It's a good question. It's also a big question. Would they have considered themselves American in their day? I mean, is that really their frame of reference? I mean, we have an understanding of what America is, which may be different from what their understanding was of what they were doing. This was the New World, and they were part of this other world. Bradford had left England because he was a religious dissenter. Winthrop would also be a religious dissenter. It's a different story. Both of them have leave England. Bradford first goes to the Netherlands with a group of other religious dissenters because the Church of England, as it's emerging, that they thought was heretical. And so they had gone to the Netherlands. I think they're thinking of themselves not as being of a certain place, but of being of this Christian world. That is, they're trying to form this society that's going to follow God's laws. And that's really what they are doing. And they come to the New World when both of them come when the English already had some settlements here, as did the Spanish. In fact, the Spanish were first on the scene. The Portuguese, the Dutch, others were already here. And they are trying to create this new world. The new world they create is what we know of as America, but would they have thought of themselves in that way? It's an interesting question. I don't think it's a question we'll ever be able to answer.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking this question is now that I going over my notes and the text, and I've always thought of it in somewhat in this vein. It's like I see them as, especially since they've been embraced and cherished as sort of the original founders of,
Mhm,
you might call it American
mhm,
democracy,
mhm.
or the precursors of what eventually came to be the Constitution, or even the notion of Declaration of Independence, which we'll be celebrating soon. And I think their writing. Now we'll talk separately about William Bradford and John Winthrop. I feel a touch. I cannot help but see a connection with liberation theology. The combination
Yes.
of Catholic belief
Mhm.
and Marxism and social justice that emerged in Latin America in the 1960s. When I read uh, both their texts, as the sermon of Winthrop and William Bradford's account, and especially the Mayflower Compact, which I hope we'll be discussing soon, I feel like it is a form of liberation theology that is almost anathema now in American political thinking.
It definitely is an idea of liberation. That is, they have been in a world where there were lots of constraints. I mean, the reason for leaving is because of the religious constraints, but there also were political, social constraints, a hierarchical society in England with aristocrats, a king. The king doesn't have as much power as I think we imagined he did, but a hierarchical society bound, of course, with an established church. And so they are leaving to create something new. And they're not simply coming to recreate what they knew in the old world. And they recognize it would be impossible to do that because they're not importing an aristocracy and a monarchy and an established church. They're coming to get away from that. But they also see a real problem in this because they want to form this community that will be held together by something. And what is it that will hold it together? And that's the big question. I mean, we arrive here, there are about 100 folks on the Mayflower when it crosses. So what's going to keep them together? Why don't they just disband? There also are native people here. And in the Virginia experience, which the English had had about 15 years earlier, as a way of survival, a lot of the English had gone to join the Indians who actually knew how to live in this new world. They don't want that to happen. I mean, they're going to work with the Indians, trade with the Indians, and so on. But They want to keep this community together. And how do they do that without the social hierarchy, the other things that are existed you're born into in the society in England or any place else in Europe? You're born into it and you stay in it. And they're breaking away and creating a new society. It's not entirely clear to them what this society will look like or what the outcome will be.
Yeah, and that society, at least in the Mayflower Compact, for example, let's say William Bradford, and who's a kind of there's a wonderful phrase that's used by John Robinson, who was their pastor
Yes.
in the Netherlands, and he writes a letter to in one of his letters he calls it the body. You can form yourself into a body politic.
Right. Yeah.
I find that phrase absolutely incredible,
Yeah.
and it's a
Yes.
precursor to everything that came afterwards.
It is. It comes up in the Massachusetts Constitution in 1780. John Adams talks about creating a civil body politic where each citizen will covenant with the whole people and the whole people covenants with each citizen. As this idea of a covenant, that is, we're forming a body. And it is something that comes up also in Winthrop's model of Christian charity. So we're not simply a group of guys coming here, a group of people coming here. We are this community, this living body. And that's really what Bradford and Winthrop see themselves doing, creating this entity that is going to grow and going to survive and grow.
Yeah, and what binds this community together is their Christian faith and their absolute dedication to the common good.
Yes.
And both of them, William Bradford and John Winthrop, emphasize that repeatedly throughout through their narratives and their texts. And so, in fact, well, that is a notion. So freedom is from, let's say, the constraints and the or the, if you wish, the tyranny of the Anglican Church or the Church of England to come here to the American continent, but to form themselves in a Christian community that is, for the lack of a better purpose, for a lot of better expression, it sounds like a socialist kind of community. I mean, they are to be bound by a commitment to the common good,
Yeah.
and not privilege their private interests in their work and in everything else that they do.
Yeah, that's always kind of one of the tensions we have about wanting to have this cohesive community, but also recognizing human nature. And in fact, the Pilgrims will call them that. They've been funded by a group of investors in England, and the deal is they will come here and work for 7 years. The company will pay their expenses after 7 years. If they have paid the company back, everything they have belongs to them. If they haven't, then everything they've done belongs to the company. And they are able to pay the company back by trade is the primary thing. In fact, the captain of the Mayflower sees what a rich fishing ground is they've landed here and says, you should actually go whaling. You'll be able to pay off the debt in a year. They don't do that. They land on the edge of the richest fishing ground in the world. And what they want to do is plant corn, because that's something the Indians teach them how to do this. So they want to become farmers instead of fishermen. Our story would be much different had they taken to the sea immediately, but they don't. But this idea is we'll form this community, and initially they do have the very socialist idea that we'll all work together for the common good, and that doesn't really work because, I see you going out to work every day. Well, I know the work's going to get done, so I sit at home. And then lots of folks come over who don't have that same religious zeal, and they simply are being sent by the company because the company wants to make a profit out of this thing. So they have lots of folks added to this, the strangers as they're called, and that becomes kind of a challenge. How do we incorporate them into the society? And
exactly.
So that becomes really another theme here, because they are incorporating newcomers into this who are all going to then subscribe to this very short Mayflower Compact that they draw up on the Mayflower in Provincetown Harbor in November of 1620, because they recognized that even then, not everyone aboard was one of us religious folks. There are folks who come because the company sent them. So what happens when we get here? In fact, remember, their charter was to go to Virginia. Virginia was already an established colony. And Bradford and the others really didn't want to go to Virginia because then they would be under the control of England. And so they arrive on Cape Cod and they said, this is where we're going to stay. Now, remember, the only thing anyone knew about Virginia was it's really hot. And they arrive on the tip of Cape Cod in November when it's really cold and windy. And members of the crew say, well, why aren't we going to Virginia? And they really want to stay here in what they call the northern parts of Virginia. And yes. Then they come up with this agreement, which it's worth actually reading, that having undertaken, and it begins, in the name of God, amen. We whose yes. names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord, King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, Ireland, yes. King, defender of the faith, etc. So they're showing their fealty to the king, even though they're leaving to get away from the king. Having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. So this is our mission. We're in the northern parts of Virginia. We'll say this is where we are. Do by these presents, solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God and of one another, covenant and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic. Yeah. For our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof, to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws and ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof we have hereunder subscribed our names at Cape Cod, the 11th of November, in the year of the reign of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, and Ireland, the 18th, and of Scotland, the 54th, Anno Domini, 1620. So they're agreeing, we'll form such laws, ordinances, statutes, offices, and we'll all obey them. Now, no one in England said, hey, when you get there, set up a government. The thinking is, well, the company will be in charge of this. But here they've taken upon themselves to form a civil body politic, and then everyone signs their name to it. That's their way of saying we subscribe to this. And this becomes the foundation of actually the town government that still exists in the town of Plymouth. This idea that this group of 41 people out of about 100 or so on the ship sign this and agree they will obey this. We're not simply going to take off for other places or try to cut our own deals. We will be one community. This is a tremendous change. This is a moment in world history.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with you. But this phrase, in the presence of God yes. and one of another, yes. covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. Yes. And I think, it is a combination of the ideal society is a combination of a theocracy and a sort of, but also a kind of a civil, with some degree of, for the lack of a better expression, secular management, but the ultimate goal is still the obeying God.
Yeah, and I think that's another piece of this too, because they always do separate the duty to God, duty to this community, but the community is always informed by the duty to God. So when Massachusetts in the 1640s gets around to codifying its laws, they don't allow ministers to serve in the House of Representatives. And I think this does go back, if you want to look at the biblical origins of this, Moses and Aaron are separate. Aaron is the priest, Moses is the lawgiver. And here they've done much the same thing. Their meetings will happen in the meeting house, and they call their church buildings meeting houses because there'll be lots of other meetings there. But I think the nature of their society is that they're all informed by this duty to God in the 17th century.
Yes.
And so there wouldn't be seen as a division, but they recognize that there is a separation. There is a secular world, but it is informed by this yes. desire to be one with God.
And in that sense, would it be comparable? Let's just to do a comparison, just for fun, is something like now, like Iran today, or some which is trying to do this more or less the same thing, combine, and the ultimate goal is to serve God, to be the theocracy or the rule of the faqih, wilayat al-faqih, like they say in Iran, and at the same time maintain some kind of civil society with
Well,
rules and regulations.
I think it's a Well, I think it's actually quite a bit different because, of
Oh, yes,
course,
yeah,
in Iran, the
yes,
supreme
yes,
leader is the Ayatollah.
yes,
So yeah, you can have the secular government, but ultimately,
yes,
this is who calls
yes.
the shots, and it's not the case here. Isaac Robinson, and I can't recall whether he comes over or not. I know his son ultimately does, or John Robinson does.
John
His
Robinson,
son,
yes.
his son Isaac does come over eventually.
Hmm.
But and when we get to the Puritans, the first line ministers aren't the ones who come over, and they play a very important role, but they're not political figures. They do operate in some context in this. When there's a heresy trial in the 1630s, the ministers are involved in that, along with Winthrop and others. The trial of Anne Hutchinson and her compatriots, who are charged with a civil offense, that is trying to disrupt the state by circulating petitions and so on. But yeah, I think there is even here a separation, although you're not going to find a lot of infidels in 17th century New England. But so it's not, I wouldn't call it a theocracy. There is certainly the ministers do have a great deal of power. And toward the end of the 18th century, 17th century, the Mathers will have a great deal of power. And in fact, in the 1680s, just to jump ahead, when the British government takes away the charter of Massachusetts, a lot of the merchants think this is great because finally we don't have the Mathers running things. The merchants start changing their tune when the new regime, the government of Edmund Andros, starts trying to tax them and take their property away and other things. They say, well, wait a minute, let's really go pushing it too far. We liked it when the ministers weren't doing this, but now when we have these characters, but there's also a character that the Puritans run into in Massachusetts, in Boston, when they arrive. William Blackstone, and Blackstone was a minister of the Church of England. In the 1620s, after the Pilgrims arrived, there are these other expeditions to the coast of Massachusetts, and one sets up just south of Boston, and Blackstone is the chaplain to this group that falls apart. But then he decides to stay. He's going to stay here. He trades with the Indians, and he has a lot of books. He is enjoying himself as much as a minister can. Well, probably more so because he doesn't really have a congregation. And then the Puritans arrive. And he says he had left England to get away from the Lord's bishop. He doesn't like the Lord's brethren any better. That is, the Puritans have done away with the hierarchy of the Church of England, and instead they want each of us to have our own relationship with God. And that is something that he finds a little tiresome because it's a great deal of proselytizing going on. And anyway, gotten away from 1620.
No, yeah. So that's right. And plus, William Bradford and John Winthrop, they also they held political power for a long period of
Oh,
time.
yeah, they did. Yeah.
Decades.
Yeah.
So they were both.
Yeah. And neither one's a minister. Remember that? We talk about Winthrop's model of Christian charity as a sermon.
Yes.
It's maybe the most famous 17th century sermon, but he's a lawyer.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And so, okay, I'm gonna start with and continue with William Bradford before I move on to John Winthrop. And what I like is, for example, William Bradford says we're gonna go to America basically I'm gonna quote what he says: "Those vast and unpeopled countries of America, which are fruitful and fit for habitation, being devoid of all civil inhabitants, where there are only savage and brutish men, which range up and down a little otherwise than the wild beast of the same." So here you begin to get this.
Yeah.
Again, it's also a pattern probably in American history, this kind of thinking.
Yeah. That this is this open land, and the people who are there have not formed a civil society. But that's something they come to realize they're mistaken about when they arrive, because they find that the native people actually do have a civil society, and they also find they have to work with them in order to survive. And they really are surprised. They arrive, as I said, in November in Cape Cod, and they're there for about 6 weeks, and then they knew about Patuxet on the other side of Cape Cod Bay, and so some of the sailors aboard had been there on earlier expeditions, and they had seen John Smith's map. And actually, in fact, it is visible from the shore in Provincetown. So they can see mainland, and there's no real good source of water on the outer Cape. And so they head to Plymouth, And this is December now, and they've kind of
Yes.
built this fortification. They put up a palisade around to protect themselves, and they know that there are native people out there. In fact, they keep seeing them, and the native people are wily enough to get out of their way. And then in it's February or March, they're all huddled in their meeting house, and all of a sudden, this Samoset walks in. He is, they describe him as a naked savage. I mean, he's not wearing a lot of clothes, but he's not completely naked. And he really astonishes them by pounding on the door saying, "Good morning, Englishman." That is, he speaks English. He'd been up to Maine. He was originally from Maine. And then a couple
Yeah.
of days later, he comes back with a man named Squanto, who had been to Spain. Squanto had seen more of Europe than they had. And he
Yes.
had been a servant in the home of the guy in charge of the Council for New England. So, and that's how he had come back. He had been kidnapped in 1614, taken to Spain to be sold as a slave. A Dominican priest purchases his freedom, sends him to England, and now here they come, and they're here as emissaries from Massasoit, who is the leader of this Wampanoag Confederation, which is involved in a power struggle with the Narragansetts. I mean, they come into this world they really don't understand, and they think these natives don't have any kind of civil society, but they find out there's a big civil society here. In fact, they've landed, and Massasoit sees they may be allies against the Narragansett, who were his traditional adversaries.
So these were the preconceived ideas they had while they were still in Holland or the Netherlands.
Yes.
And then, so these are but they decided to go ahead despite these threats that were looming ahead.
Yeah.
And so they do come and then find, as you said, a different kind of situation on the ground. And so it's, and I wondered about that. I mean, where did they get that information from? Is that the Spanish or the early English travelers to Virginia?
Some would have been from the Spanish. I think one of their
Yes.
real sources was John Smith. John Smith
Yes.
did a map of New England after his voyage, and he sees New England really as the place for England's colonial venture. He had been in Virginia, and Virginia was a death trap. And another English guy named Bartholomew Gosnold had been to Cape Cod in the 1604, 1605. Samuel Champlain had also been to Cape Cod. He thought this should be the capital of New France. But then some of his guys get into a fight with the Indians. So Gosnold had been there. And in fact, he named Martha's Vineyard, the Elizabeth Islands, other places. His men also say we should name this place Cape Cod. And at that time, it just meant the very tip. So Smith knew Gosnold. Gosnold dies in Jamestown and says, this climate is terrible. You should really go to Cape Cod. And so Smith maps it. And he sees this area. Now, the French had claimed the St. Lawrence River. As I said, Champlain had said, let's set up shop on Cape Cod. But the St. Lawrence gives them access to the interior and the fur trade. The Dutch were along the Hudson River in the New Netherlands. So here you have New France, New Netherlands, and this area, this trajectory from east of the Hudson, it juts east. John Smith names New England, because he sees this will be the base of England's new world. Yeah. Virginia, he thinks, is hopeless. In fact, they had kicked him out in 1609 or so. So you have New England, really, and there's a council for New England that started in Old England to exploit the resources of this area. And there are all kinds of fanciful ideas about what might be here. Everyone hopes for gold because the Spanish had found lots of gold. They don't find it here, but the fur trade is another thing drawing them here. There's a legend of this big lake of the Iroquois teeming with beaver pelts, and beaver pelts were in demand for making felt in England at the time. So that's something they're hoping to get here. As I said, fishing is going to be the thing that ultimately is going to sustain them, but the pilgrims don't take to the sea.
What I like about Bradford's narrative is like at the end, he begins to bring up some of the themes that eventually would become very salient, I think, at least in understanding parts of American history, which is like, here's a section on how prosperity weakens community.
Yeah.
And then there's that tension that runs through American history. And then, of course, eventually, prosperity will eventually
he sees
triumph over community.
Because they're able to pay their debts, and their children are surviving, and in fact surviving so much that they're founding new towns. So new towns on Cape Cod and just north of Plymouth, and so the old meeting house in Plymouth, he says, is deserted, And he says that having made so many others rich, it now is poor. And you think you think he should be looking at this thinking, wow, we really adventured a lot. It was a big struggle, but here we are, we're succeeding. But he really sees it as a failure because they're no longer this cohesive community that they had hoped to have. Instead, we do have separate towns and people pursuing their self interest. And so there's a real lament at the end of this that what we had hoped to accomplish, we haven't.
Yeah, and by
Maybe that's true.
16,
Maybe it's the human
by
condition.
yeah, and then 21 years later, he was beginning to worry about the corruption, how corruption is gonna,
Yeah,
how to keep corruption at bay.
yeah,
There's
yeah,
a section on that too,
yeah.
and so you could see in a way that his narrative, his story, kind of sums up the arc of history in so many
Yeah,
so many interesting ways.
it does. It
Would
does.
you? Yes.
And then Squanto, who had been their emissary with Massasoit,
Yes.
Massasoit realizes Squanto is, as Bradford says, playing his own game. That is, he sees an opportunity here to play off the English against these folks, and Massasoit send out the order to have him killed because that's what you do in their community when someone is a troublemaker. And Bradford refuses, and then it leads to souring the relationship with Massasoit. And then Squanto does die. It's kind of mysteriously somehow, and that kind of pacifies things with Massasoit. So they've entered this world, a very serious world, where there were rules that the English don't really understand. And there are rumors in the 1620s about different Indian groups wanting to basically attack Plymouth, which they could have done. And Miles Standish goes on the warpath against them. And so they had come with this idea of everyone will like us and we'll be able to get along. Plus, these people don't really understand civil government, which we do. And that doesn't really work well because these people had their own sense of civil government. And how do we deal with that? And then they do get into trading with the Dutch, but I mean, they're not saying, boy, all of us Europeans are here and we can do whatever we want. There's a tension with the Dutch and a fear of the Spanish or the French coming in and a real fear of Jesuits coming in. So you have all of these problems that Bradford is dealing with. And remember, he's not a politician. He's not a
Yeah.
minister. He's just a guy who was called on to take on this role because the previous governor had died of heat stroke in April of
Yeah.
1621. They didn't understand the
John
climate.
Carver, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so they have all of the, and by the way, about half of the people who come over in 1620 wind up dying by the next year. One of the things that sustains the Plymouth colony and later the Massachusetts Bay colony is they come over as families, which means there are children and there are women who can have more children. So that's the thing that's going to sustain them. The Virginia colony was really sustained by bringing over more young men who are going to work for a few years and then die. And there's really not a real path for advancement there. But here there is because they all have to work and they understand this because they have this godly mission that they are on to set up this civil body politic here in the interest. They mention the interest of our king as well as the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. That's the first thing, and then the honor of our king and country are kind of the second mission here, which may be put in case word of this gets back to England. Why we're setting up an independent government here.
Yeah. Another thing that's interesting to me, and I don't know, I can't think of similar examples in history, or at least in at that time, is a bunch of dedicated religious nonconformists, like William Bradford was, or separatists,
Mm-hmm.
uh, who decided to break away from their home country to 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 build a new life elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And so that shows to the extreme to which they were
Oh
dedicated
yeah,
to their religion.
it
And
does. Yeah.
I accept, maybe with the exception of the Israelites or the Hebrews fleeing Egypt
Mm.
in the Old Testament and so on. I can't think of a comparable example like that.
Well, in many ways, the ancient Israelites were one of their models of
Yes,
this
yes,
community bound together by covenant
yes,
and having to undergo these trials as a
yes.
way of sustaining ourselves. So that's a model very much on their minds. I mean,
Mhm.
everything they did was informed by what they knew from the Bible. This is really their standard. If
Yes,
you owned a book, it would be a Bible.
yes,
And so this is really what they had studied. And, you read their longer writings and the biblical references are everywhere. The citations are everywhere because it's what they knew. It's the way they understood the world. So they had this example of this group of people committed to a religious ideal, which they're also going to form a civil society out of. And, the Bible is the story of this attempt, David and Solomon,
yes.
and the attempt of the judges governing, and how do we set up any kind? And the book of Samuel, where these people really want a king, and Samuel, the prophet, thinks you don't need a king, you just need to figure out how to run a civil society. But the people insist on a king. These stiff-necked people, he calls them. So it is the problem. And here they are doing this. They're doing something that they know hasn't really been done for a couple of thousand years.
So we have the separatists who absolutely reject uh, everything in the Church of England, and then eventually, when John Winthrop came over, he was a little bit more moderate, right? It was the Puritans were
Yeah,
a little
yeah.
less extremist than the separatists.
Well, they had wanted to stay within the Church of England, but do
Yes,
away with the rituals because they're
yes,
focused. They want everything to follow the biblical pattern. And the
mhm,
Bible doesn't talk about Christmas. It doesn't talk about the priests wearing vestments, incense, stained glass. The Puritans in England are smashing all the stained glass windows. And all
yes,
of the icons in the churches, they are very much like, say, the Taliban or other groups who have done similar things as a way of doing away with what they see as heresy. And initially, of course, they're also a learned group. That is, all of us will study the scripture and the minister will give a 2-hour sermon. We will all take notes and then study it afterward. This is why they're printing all this. I mean, then 6 years after they start Massachusetts Bay Colony, they bring over a printing press so they can print sermons and study them. So this is really their mission, but doing away with all of these accretions that have sprung up around the faith. So you just have the minister reading a bit of biblical text and then explaining it. This is why you need to have ministers who have gone to Oxford or Cambridge, and Cambridge becomes the college for the Puritans, as opposed to Oxford, which is more orthodox in England. And initially, there are Puritans working within the church hierarchy, but then after about in the 1620s, new Archbishop of Canterbury, King Charles I wants to tamp down on this movement. And that's what leads to this idea of, hey, let's go somewhere else because England is clearly on the road to hell. And we need
yeah,
to save our souls by getting out. And of course, one of the great ironies for them is that the Puritans who stay in England wind up taking over the British government. And so here, these guys, by the 1640, have set up the Massachusetts Bay Colony to be this model for the rest of the world. But now, if you want a model for the rest of the world, London is a much better place for it than Boston is.
yeah. So it's a self-willed diaspora, so to speak.
Yes.
They
Yeah.
chose to emigrate. And the amount of principle. You mentioned Cambridge. Winthrop studied in Cambridge for a couple of years,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
mean, but William Bradford was practically self-educated.
Yes.
He
Oh, yeah.
wasn't.
Yeah.
He didn't have much of a
The
formal education.
Pilgrims are less of an educated group. The Puritan movement is a more educated group. And so, yeah, they are scholars and men like John Cotton and Roger Williams and Joseph Hooker, these others. I mean, they are extraordinarily learned, educated men. The leaders of the pilgrim community really are not. Farmers, mechanics, other tradesmen. who are very devout. And the Puritan movement is more of a, what we call more of a middle class movement, this idea of, you're able to study and think about things. Winthrop, of course, is a lawyer. His father had been a lawyer, and his father was a bureaucrat in Queen Elizabeth's administration. So it's these aren't people working from the bottom up for the most part, but they have this religious idea of what do I have to do to be saved, and that's the big question on their minds: is how will I be saved, and will I be one of the elect? And that's really their question.
Yes. And that is a bit of Calvinism,
Yes.
which is the grace and the how the notion of grace. Interesting. I mean, the notion of covenant. I mean, William Bradford's community organized himself in congregations.
Yeah. Yeah.
That did what he did. So that I'm assuming that's the origin of the Congregational Church.
Yes, it is. It is. By the way, David Hall, who is a noted scholar, one of the probably the leading scholar of Puritans, says there really isn't that big of a difference between the Puritans and the Pilgrims. He says that was something made up in the 19th century by the Unitarians, who wanted to trace their origins not to the bad old Puritans, but to the good Pilgrims. And he discounted. I mean, there's a similar idea here. So the Puritans initially are within the Church of England, but when they get here, they say, okay, it's the congregation. In the Church of England, if you are the archbishop, you decide who are the bishops and so on. And remember, by this time, the archbishop is really appointed by the king. So it's a political appointment. You get to decide, okay, this priest goes to this parish, this priest goes to this parish. And so that's a big choice. In this new world, the idea is the congregation appoints the minister. And so they have you come in and give a few sermons, and then they decide whether or not they want to keep you. And then if so, you're the minister. But remember, they're now the ones calling the shots. You've been hired by them. And there's going to be a limit to how much of the preaching you can do about your sins because, they hired you. And you read the minister's diaries. There's a lot of stuff about they're not giving me enough firewood, other things. And by the way, people can go to different meeting houses. If they hear, you're a really great preacher, we'll go to your meeting house instead of they stop coming to my meeting house because you're a better preacher. And it's a 5 mile walk, but we'll do that just so we have a better experience of getting right with God. By the way, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they say everyone has to live within half-mile of the meeting house because they want to keep these communities together. There'll be land outside for farming, but they want these compact towns that will then be within half a mile of the meeting house because everyone is going to go there several times a week.
Yeah. So a lot of and the Puritans then. So that's why. I mean, before I move on to something else. I mean, is that why New England has the most congregational churches in the United States, or is it because?
Yes, it is. This is where they start. And by the way, in the 19th century, they split. In the Unitarians grow out of the Congregationalists. And then also the Baptist movement emerges in England, also in the 17th century. And it's this idea, should you baptize infants? And, well, they don't really understand what they are being baptized into. So the idea is, once you've reached the age of understanding, then you can make this choice. And that's when you're baptized, when you actually understand it. And so this is anathema to the Puritan idea that you baptize infants because otherwise they're damned. Well, you baptize them when they've reached this age of consent, age of understanding. And you don't simply baptize by sprinkling on water. You do what John the Baptist did by dunking people into the water. And this isn't something that the Puritans welcome. The Quaker movement also emerges out of the Puritan movement in the 17th century. This is idea, okay, so we've done away with the hierarchy of the church. So then what holds us together? And the Quaker idea is, well, each of us has this inner voice speaking to us. Well, when Quakers do start arriving here in New England, this is really a bad thing because if you don't really need ministers, then why do we have a church hierarchy? We don't have the bishops, but the ministers will get together in a synod and determine things. But now you have these Quakers saying, well, each of us can find our own path to salvation. And so you have these different, by the way, if you're a member of the Anglican Church or the Catholic Church, you see these different denominations spinning off. We said, well, that's exactly what we said was going to happen. If everyone can choose his or her own path to salvation, naturally they're going to have lots of different congregations, denominations. But you have, yes, so Congregationalism really emerges in New England. By the way, there's a great congregational library in downtown Boston that has the records of lots of these churches, and they've been digitizing a lot of the church records. And you think, boy, this is just an account of people praying, but actually, it's an account of the depravity they're fighting against. Because if you've committed some transgression, you have to confess to the rest of the congregation, or you have to explain why you want to become a member. Not everyone can become a member of the church. You have to attend, but membership is something else, and you have to again sign a covenant and be accepted by the other members into this. So it's a record again of our human failing as we try to live up to an ideal.
Yeah. So you mentioned before we move on, you mentioned the question that they were heavily influenced by the story of the Hebrew, the Old Testament, and it does. John Winthrop, towards the end of his sermon, he talks about the God of Israel.
Yes. We shall know. This is such a great passage when he goes through his. And again, it's structured like a Puritan sermon with a little bit of text that God Almighty, in his most holy and wise providence, hath so disposed of the condition of mankind, as in all times some must be rich, some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in submission. This is the way the world is. There are some rich people, poor people. Some are high and eminent. But then the question is, what holds them together? And when we get to this new world, what's going to keep the high and eminent in degree from oppressing those who are below them, or the poor from realizing, hey, there are more of us than there are of them. Why don't we just kill them and take their property? So what holds them together? And that is really the thing, he's puzzling over in this sermon. He explains about rules of lending, other things in this. But it is this idea of we're forming a body politic. It's a living organism. And so he said he goes through this in great detail. And this, thus stands the cause between God and us. We are entered into a covenant with him for this work. We have taken out a commission. Remember, he's a lawyer. The Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter is something he has helped to draft, and this is their commission. The Lord has given us leave to draw our own articles. We have professed enterprise these and those accounts upon these and those ends. We have hereupon besought him of favor and blessing. Now, if the Lord shall please to hear us and bring us in peace to the place we desire, then hath he ratified this covenant and sealed our commission, and will expect a strict performance of the articles contained in it. So God's let us draw up our own articles. If he gets us to where we're going, he's upheld his side of the bargain. Now it's up to us to uphold ours. So he says, if we shall neglect the observation of these articles, which are the ends we have propounded, and dissembling with our God, shall fall to embrace this present world and prosecute our carnal intentions, seeking great things for ourselves and our posterity, the Lord will surely break out in wrath against us, be revenged of such a perjured people, and make us know the price of the breach of such a covenant. I think just about every religious tradition in the world would say, prosecuting carnal intentions is probably something God wants you to rein in. And seeking great thing, dissembling with God and embracing the present world instead of thinking about, but then seeking great things for ourselves and our posterity. So here the message is, if we become rich, powerful, successful, it's not a sign that we've been doing what God wants. It's a sign that we've broken the covenant with God. You think about this, by the way, there was always an argument about when Winthrop gave this. And if you look at different histories, you'll see different accounts. It used to be that it was given aboard the Arabella, or it was given when they arrived. The thinking now is it was given in Southampton before they left. And I always found that a little troubling, because who's going to get on the ship knowing that if you succeed, it's a sign of failure? He says, the only way to avoid this shipwreck, again, it is before they get on the ship, so that's on their minds, and to provide for our posterity, is to follow the counsel of Micah, another Old Testament prophet, to do justly, to love
Yes.
mercy, to walk humbly
Yes.
with our God. For this end, we
Yes.
must be knit together in this work as one man. We must
Yes.
entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must
Yes.
be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work. As members of the same body, so shall we
Yeah.
keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. The Lord will be our God and delight to dwell among us
Yes.
as his own people, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we acquainted with. We shall find that the God of Israel is among us when 10 of us shall be able to
Yes.
resist 1,000 of our
Yes.
enemies, when he shall
Yes.
make us a praise and a glory that men will say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make it like that of New England.
Yeah, and let's stop here for a second before we get to
Yeah,
his most famous
yeah.
phrase. Yeah. So in part one of this sermon, there's a tremendous amount of what nowadays we might call humanism. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
Christian love, the
Yes, yes,
absolutely unconditional Christian love.
yes,
I mean,
yes.
it's that's the leitmotif of the sermon,
Yes, it
basically,
is. Yeah. And
and
remember, New Model Christian charity
yes,
in the book of the proverb of in Matthew, that faith, hope, and charity. Now, charity is often translated as love. Today, that's the translation of that phrase: faith, hope,
yes,
and love. And it is this Christian love that he's talking about. What binds them together in this community? It's not
yes.
simply okay. We don't have the covenant the way the folks in here did, or laws, but it is this bond they are trying to create. And it is a new model a new model of this Christian love that we are creating.
Yeah, before the end of the first part of the sermon, Monica, he says this love is absolutely necessary uh, to the being of the body of
Yeah.
Christ.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. And their image of the church, and the church isn't a building, the church is the community of believers, and it is
Yes,
modeled on the body of Christ. And it is this
yes,
love that holds it together. And
yes,
so this love that holds the community together, and and as he talks here to what they're going to do together: rejoice, mourn, labor, suffer,
yes,
abridge ourselves of our superfluities, the things we don't need, to supply
yes,
those who don't have
yes.
things.
Yeah, it even exceeds the idea of liberation theology in
Yeah,
some ways.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, this is as utopian as can be, but it's a kind of a Christian utopia, and
yeah. But they also
it,
understand how bad societies can be. I mean, they've left this other society, and I think they also understand human nature. And in fact, throughout Winthrop's time as governor, I mean, and he is voted out a few times by his an arch rival, Thomas Dudley. And
yeah,
I was asking one of Dudley's descendants about why Dudley and Winthrop didn't get along. He said, "Well, Dudley was really kind of a jerk." I mean, but I think they understood this, and it's not simply, "Hey, I have a better idea for how to hold this together." And this is power, and I want it. And I think one of the great things about Winthrop is he understands the limitations on what he as governor can do.
yeah, yeah, and I think what I like about the sermon is that the part one and part two. In part one, it talks about Christian love, the necessity of absolutely being bound by Christian love. Then he uses in the beginning of part two of his sermon is it rests now to make some application of
Yes.
this discourse by the present design.
Hmm.
And then in that later on, he says to seek out a place of cohabitation and consortship under a due form of government, both civil and ecclesiastical.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
In such cases as this, the care of the public must oversway all private respect,
Hmm.
by which not only conscience but mere civil policy doth bind us. For it is a true rule that particular estates cannot subsist in the ruin of the public.
Hmm.
So public interest comes
Yeah.
first, always,
Really,
always,
really
always.
does. Yeah, yeah. And think about it too. We think that this sermon was given at Southampton at a church in England.
Yes,
And after John Cotton, who was
Yes.
really their leading theological light, gives his sermon, and Cotton's not going to go with them to the New World.
Yes.
So Cotton had given kind of the ecclesiastical thing, and here Winthrop is the civil authority. And it's
Yeah.
unclear at this point. I mean, he has been appointed by the company to be the governor of this, which means he'll
Mm-hmm.
administer it. But when they get to the New World, he just sort of says, and they're set up with a corporate charter, the Massachusetts Bay Company. Okay. And he is the governor, the chief executive officer of this company that's going to trade between the Merrimack River and the Charles River on the coast of Massachusetts. And they have shareholders who will be the voters. They're the ones who elect the board of directors and the governor. And when they get to the New World, Winthrop calls a meeting, and it is a meeting of the company. He invites not only shareholders who have come, but also all freemen. And he announces that this is the general court, that this is the meeting of the company, actually. So he transforms what had been this corporate charter into a civil government, and wants everyone here to be part of it. It's not just, okay, we have a couple of dozen shareholders here, so they will be the ones running things. No, all free men will be part of this general court to govern this. And that, think about Plymouth was a relatively small community. There like 1,200 people had come over with Winthrop. And in fact, they had so many that they have to separate into a number of separate towns, but holding them together is this general court. But further holding it together is this idea of this covenant, this civil body politic that they are creating.
Yeah. And then, of course, we haven't mentioned it yet. So after he talks about the God of Israel,
Yeah.
The Lord make it so what he says, for we must consider that we shall be a city upon
A hill.
a hill.
Yes.
The eyes of all the people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world.
Yes. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak
Yes.
evil of the ways of God and all professors for God's sake. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants and cause
Yes.
their prayers to be turned into curses upon us till we be
Yes.
consumed out of the good land whither we are going. So yeah, city upon a hill, we often use that and think everyone's looking at us with admiration. He's saying,
Yes.
if you're a city on a hill, everyone sees what you're doing, and likely you are likely going to fail, and everyone is going to know it. And it's not just a bad thing for you; it's a bad thing for the whole Christian cause. Shaming the faces of many of God's worthy servants and causing their prayers to be turned into curses. I mean, this is why would anyone go with this, knowing what the stakes are? Yes, a city upon a hill. The phrase itself, I think, comes back into our political vocabulary with John F. Kennedy in 1961 when he gives a speech to the Massachusetts legislature before he becomes president. He had studied at Harvard, and this sermon kind of was something being taught in various courses at Harvard, which was the keeper of it, founded in 1636 by these characters, a way of training their own ministers as well as Native American ministers. And he uses that phrase about city on a hill. And he's really thinking, again, the State House in Boston is on a hill, a Beacon Hill. And Ronald Reagan uses the phrase
Yes.
shining city upon a hill to refer to America as a whole. And Michael Dukakis
Yes.
also uses city upon a hill, the idea everyone is watching us with admiration. I think Winthrop sees being so visible to everyone isn't really such a good thing.
But this notion of a city upon a hill will have different connotations, later on in history, in American history. I think that's by the time we come to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, we'll see that maybe it's transformed into the notion, which is already implied in this text, a notion of virtue. Maybe virtue is essential to the functioning of a democracy or a republic.
It
And
is,
so,
yeah. And as you said,
yes,
with Winthrop talking about, the public interest, the public good,
yes,
and how are we behaving? It's another thing that, by the way, Kennedy invokes in his speech is how will we be judged by history? And I mean, and of course, with the Declaration of Independence, you have this idea, and it's not we're doing this because we're better, but we're doing this because this is the human right. This is human nature. I mean, I was just reading this morning Maria Machado's Nobel Prize lecture, which is an astonishing document about this quest for freedom. And freedom is a choice, which these guys are making. And then the question is, how do
Yes.
we preserve it? How
Yes.
do we ensure that it will be something that future generations will have? And so you have this moment when Winthrop is thinking about this, is really fraught moment as we're venturing off into this new world, and what's going to keep us from killing one another, from oppressing one another, doing these other things, which is something people will do. That is, they're aspiring, as the framers of the Declaration were, to touch the better angels of our nature, as Abraham Lincoln put it.
Yeah, so this notion of freedom, which the Pilgrims' notion of freedom, or the Separatists and or the Puritans' notion of freedom, as we continue to have these conversations, begins to change over time. It acquires different connotations and different meanings, and this is like the freedom for them meant escaping the tyranny of the Catholic Church and its remnants, residues in the Anglican Church, taking on this very dangerous voyage across the Atlantic Ocean, and with no really clear prospects on the horizon, and then landing in this, Plymouth and other nearby colonies and so nearby areas, and starting a new life from scratch and making it happen. So that their notion of freedom, it's all to preserve the faith and maintain the covenant. And by the way, when we talked, I'm thinking of, I may have told you that the episode is called "Of Compacts and Covenants," and I can't remember the word compact being used else in other contexts besides William Bradford's text. Do you?
I can't, not offhand. I'm sure if we looked, we could probably find it. But yeah, it is an agreement among people. That is this a solemn compact. And we see others, the treaties they make with Massasoit. It's a pact. I mean, that's where the word comes from. And so it is this agreement among people. A covenant is not simply an agreement between you and me, but it's an agreement between a broader community as well as with God. And that's the idea of
partnership with
the
God.
partnership with God. Yeah.
And so it is a purely Protestant concept.
I believe it is. And because you have to sign on to the compact. It's not as though you're baptized and you're part of this community. You actually have to make this choice. And so that is essential to it, because God does give us free will, free choice. So what do we do with it? And that is always the question. It's the real tension here, because the goal is for everyone to be saved, but there's no way of knowing if you will be saved, because salvation is something that comes through God's free grace, and you have no way of influencing God in that decision.
And this leads me to wonder, because it's these two notions, especially the marriage covenant, it's clearly based on a notion eliminating the intermediaries, the church, the priests, and so on, to have a direct relationship with God, and sort of with the notion of sola scriptura, and which implies there needs to be a degree of literacy, the ability to read the Bible, and through that reading to connect with God.
Yes, exactly. Which is why they set up schools. Which is why everyone, boys and girls, have to learn how to read, so that everyone can know this. Why they're translating the Bible into English and to other languages, so everyone can read it and understand it and come to their own decision. And the idea is aren't saved through doing good works. I mean, you're really nice. You help old ladies across the street, do those things. Yeah. That's if you don't have this faith, but you can only know this by studying the scripture. And also they want people to listen to the ministers. When Anne Hutchinson gets into trouble in the later 1630s, they say, well, you've disobeyed the commandment because you're not honoring your father and mother being the leaders of the Commonwealth. And she says, well, wait a minute, suppose my father doesn't fear God. And so should I respect him then? And I entertain someone who does fear God. That's disrespecting my father, but it's fearing God. So she really is someone who has studied the scripture. In fact, her father was a minister. And so she really tangles them up with this theology. It's one of the problems they run into. When everyone is studying this, people will come to different interpretations and sometimes a better understanding than what the leaders of the society have. So yeah, but everyone has to be able to read so that they can understand this. And of course, reading opens us up to lots of other ideas. It's one of the real conundrums in this particular religious community.
And you could see how the printing press had a
Yes.
huge impact on religious practice.
Oh yeah, it definitely does. Yeah.
Yes. And I think this is a good point to stop. And I'm going to be eagerly waiting for our next conversation on what is an American,
Yes.
with Saint-Jean de Crèvecoeur and Benjamin Franklin.
Yes.
Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Bob, and
Anouar.
I hope to see you soon.
So do I. Thank you. Thank you so much, Anouar.